Imagine the year is 1504. The air in Florence smells like expensive linseed oil, unwashed peasants, and the crushing weight of artistic expectation. You are Giovanni, a man whose hands have the structural integrity of a cooked spaghetti noodle. While the rest of the Renaissance is obsessed with linear perspective, the revolutionary technique that makes two-dimensional paintings look like you can walk into them, Giovanni is stuck in a different dimension. Specifically, the wiggly dimension. He tries to paint a Doric column, and it looks like a tube of toothpaste being squeezed by a panicked toddler. He tries to paint a straight horizon, and it looks like a seismic reading of an earthquake in a gelatin factory. He's the only artist in history who could make a blueprint for a fortress look like a bowl of ramen. How does a man who can't draw a straight line survive in an era obsessed with geometry? Let's find out. Giovanni wasn't always a chaotic squiggle maker. He was born into a family of stonecutters who took their rigid geometry very seriously. His father, a man whose eyebrows seemed permanently frozen in a state of architectural disapproval, used to beat him with a heavy T-square, which, ironically, only made his hand tremor more pronounced. In the 1500s, being an artist wasn't just about expressing your soul. It was about mastering the dark arts of Euclidean geometry. You needed to understand vanishing points, orthogonals, and the golden ratio. If you couldn't draw a perfect cube, you were basically just a guy with a fancy brush and a death wish. Giovanni's childhood was a series of failed apprenticeships. He was kicked out of every workshop from Milan to Rome. One master actually tried to exorcise him, convinced his hands were possessed by a snake demon. It wasn't a demon. It was just a severe case of what we now call artistic instability. But in 1504, it was basically heresy. He had the passion of Michelangelo but the hand-eye coordination of a drunk goat. His life in Florence was a precarious tightrope walk of deception. He lived in a drafty studio above a bakery, where the scent of warm sourdough often masked the smell of his failed pigments. He survived by painting portraits of wealthy, nearsighted merchants who were too vain to notice that their noses were slightly slanted to the left or that their aristocratic chins seemed to ripple like a pond disturbed by a pebble. "It's the new style," he would whisper, sweat beading on his forehead. "It captures the fluidity of the soul." The merchants would nod, squinting, and pay him in bread and copper coins, terrified that admitting they didn't see the art would make them look like uncultured peasants. Then came the job. Lorenzo the Loud, a man with more gold florins than brain cells and a temperament that shifted from jovial to homicidal in the time it took to sneeze, decided he needed a portrait of the city's new cathedral. Not just any portrait. He demanded a mathematically perfect representation to impress the Pope. If Giovanni delivered, he'd be rich. If he failed, he'd be sent to the oubliette, which, fun fact, was a real dungeon where they just threw you in a hole and forgot you existed. Giovanni stood before the massive canvas, his brush shaking so hard it sounded like a rattling radiator. Every time he tried to draw the base of the cathedral, the line would curve into a charming, but entirely incorrect, wave. The pressure was immense. He was essentially trying to perform heart surgery with a garden rake. The public was watching, the Pope was coming, and Lorenzo was sharpening his guillotine-adjacent mood. If he couldn't fix his lines, he was headed for a very short, very final career change. The panic began to set in. Giovanni spent his first night staring at the blank, terrifying expanse of the canvas. He tried to visualize the vanishing point, but his brain refused to process the concept of straight. To Giovanni, a line was a suggestion, a mood, a gentle suggestion of movement. It was never a destination. He tried to draw the foundation using a piece of charcoal and a heavy stone, but the stone slipped, leaving a jagged scar across the primed fabric that looked remarkably like a lightning bolt striking a worm. He tried everything. He strapped his wrist to a wooden plank, but the plank just snapped in half, resulting in a painting that looked like the cathedral had survived a massive earthquake. He tried drinking a gallon of strong Tuscan wine to numb the nerves, which resulted in a portrait of the cathedral that looked like a kaleidoscope of nightmares, a dizzying array of swirling spires that seemed to be melting into the sky. He even tried holding the brush with his foot, which accidentally produced a masterpiece of modern art that people actually liked. A passerby stopped, stared at the distorted, swirling colors, and wept openly. claiming it represented the turmoil of the human condition. Giovanni was briefly famous for 10 minutes, but Lorenzo threw the canvas in the fire because cathedrals don't look like abstract spaghetti. The chaos escalated. He hired 3 apprentices to hold his arms steady, but they got into a fight about the best way to cook pesto. One insisted on pine nuts, the other on walnuts, and the third argued that garlic was the only thing that mattered. As they shouted, the canvas became a casualty of their culinary war. The resulting splatter looked like the cathedral had been hit by a medieval artillery shell. He was running out of time, money, and sanity. He looked at the unfinished work, a series of squiggles that looked more like a map of the city's sewage system than its spiritual center. He sat in the corner of his studio, surrounded by ruined canvases and the mocking silence of his own failure. Desperate, Giovanni locked himself in his studio for 3 days with nothing but vinegar and a copy of Da Vinci's Notebook. He was staring at a diagram of a bird's wing, a marvel of engineering, when, suddenly, a draft hit his candle, causing a shadow of a straight-edged ruler to project onto the canvas. It hit him. He didn't need to draw the line. He needed to cheat the line. He realized that if he couldn't control his hand, he could control the environment. He didn't need steadiness. He needed gravity, leverage, and friction. He tore apart his furniture. He ripped the legs off his bed, scavenged the hinges from his door, and stole a stack of pulleys and counterweights from a nearby clockmaker's workshop while the man was busy arguing with a customer about the accuracy of his sundials. It was a Rube Goldberg machine of massive proportions. He sat in the middle of this contraption, his arm locked into a leather brace, and let the weights do the work. He didn't draw the line. He pulled a lever, and the mechanical arm glided across the canvas with the precision of a guillotine. The tension of the rope was perfectly calibrated to resist his natural tremors, effectively ironing his movements into a rigid, singular path. It was the birth of the world's first primitive plotting machine. When the reveal happened, Lorenzo walked into the room, flanked by 2 bodyguards and a skeptical cardinal. Lorenzo was ready to scream, his face already purple in anticipation of the inevitable failure. He looked at the painting. His eyes widened. He stepped closer, leaning in until his nose almost touched the linen. He pulled out his own measuring rod, checking the angles. They were perfect. The lines were straight. The perspective was perfect. The cathedral looked like it could be touched. Lorenzo was so stunned, he actually stopped yelling for 10 seconds, which was a historical record. Magnificent, the cardinal breathed, crossing himself. The grace of God is clearly in your brush, maestro. Giovanni bowed, his hands still trembling behind his back, hidden by his oversized velvet sleeves. It is a gift, he muttered, keeping his head down to hide the sweat of terror. He became the toast of Florence. He didn't tell anyone it was all done with a collection of pulleys and a stolen wooden plank. He became the most sought-after architect in Italy, producing perfectly drafted buildings all by just pulling levers. The irony, of course, is that he never learned to draw, but he ended up revolutionizing the way art was made by inventing mechanical assistants. The guilds were baffled. They couldn't understand how he worked so fast and with such uncanny precision. Rumors flew that he was using alchemy or had struck a deal with a geometry-obsessed spirit. Giovanni spent the rest of his life as a master who never actually touched a brush. He wore fine silks, lived in a palazzo, and employed a small army of clockmakers to maintain his artistic armaments. He spent his days in the back room, sipping wine and listening to the rhythmic clicking of his machines, occasionally laughing at the absurd realization that he had tricked the greatest minds of his age. He wasn't an artist. He was the first industrial engineer, hiding in plain sight behind a facade of artistic genius. Whenever a young, struggling painter came to him for advice, Giovanni would look them in the eye and say, "The secret is in the wrist." Then he would go back to his pulleys and gears. The moral? If you can't be good at something, just build a giant, over-engineered machine to do it for you. It's the Renaissance way. And that, dear viewer, is how a man who couldn't draw a straight line accidentally invented the future of engineering, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary art isn't about what you can do with your hands, but what you can build to bypass your own limitations. He died a wealthy man, leaving behind a legacy of perfectly straight lines, none of which he had ever actually drawn by hand, leaving the historians for centuries to to come completely baffled by his supernatural talent for perspective. He was the great paradox of 1504, a man who saw the world in squiggles but forced it into squares, one click of a lever at a time.